Good morning. Chanukah. We begin by thanking our sponsors. Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Kislev, Shmuel Malka Esterson, in memory of their parents, in commemoration of the yahrzeits, Yitzchak Laib ben Aharon HaKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avraham, Hinda Bas Henech Efraim, in honor of the Rav for all he does for our kehilla, and thank you, Bill Eskin, in honor of Chaim Rothschild. Ready to go? Okay, today's daf is Daf Yomi. We are going to begin, we're picking up from where we left off yesterday, three lines from the bottom. I'm sorry, just getting hooked up. You good? Omar Mar, mitmanya bei ad soif mayada itaisiv chaga de shvuah. From the 8th day of the month is when ultimately we were minatzeach, we prevailed over the tzedukim when it came to the Yom Tov of Shavuos. And we explained this briefly yesterday, which was that the tzedukim insisted that Shavuos should always be on Sunday, because it says in the pasuk Mimachras HaShabbos, and Rashi explains over here that, if you can see into the very first wide line of Rashi, the Tapal behen Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai spoke with them. He started dealing with them. Amar lahem, shaitim, you foolish people, minayin lachem. Where do you know this from? V'loi haya adam shechziru davar chutz mi zakein echad. No one had the audacity to respond to him besides for one zakein. Shahaya mefatfet kenegdai v'amar Moshe Rabbeinu oyev Yisrael haya. Moshe Rabbeinu loved the Jews. He knew that Shavuos is only one day. So what did he do? He decided that Shavuos should always be immediately after Shabbos. Like this, they should have 2 days of a Yom Tov. You have Shabbos, which is immediately followed by a Yom Tov. Everyone knows that a 2-day Yom Tov is great. It's even better when it's a 3-day Yom Tov. Moshe Rabbeinu loved Jews. And he wanted Jews to enjoy Shabbos and Yom Tov as much as they possibly can, especially if you always make it on a Sunday, never have to miss any work. It's always just works out perfectly convenient. So therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu, he saw all the benefit for Klal Yisrael, and therefore he made the Shavuos always fall out on Sunday. V'dachlois, and ultimately he dismissed him. V'hochol hen labaisusim mikoyach hapsukim al karchem v'chazur b'hen. In other words, ultimately, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was able to be menatzeach. He was able to prevail over this argument, and therefore it always worked. In other words, he was able to get them to prevail, and therefore we were able to actually follow the calendar and have Shavuos fall out on the calendric date, not just on Sunday. Okay. So the Gemara asks, again, and what does that mean? Therefore, we don't say hespedim there. So the Gemara asks, what do you have to write? Why do you have to make a takana that we're not going to say any hespedim until the end of Yom Tov? Lema aramayid. Just say until the Mayid. The only relevant point over here is that from the beginning of the month until Yom Tov, there was no hespedim. Umayed Gufei, the actual Yom Tov itself of Pesach, Yom Tofu. It's Yom Tov. So why do you have to have a special Megillus Taanis to tell you there's no Espedim in Yom Tov? It's Yom Tov already. Umayed Gufei Yom Tofu. V'asar V'amar Rav Papa K'damar Rav Le'nitzrucha Ella Lesser Yaim Shalafanav. It had to be. We needed to have it there to answer the day from beforehand. In other words, he's bringing back that we mentioned this with regard to the halachas of Rosh Chodesh. In other words, the reason why it has to be mentioned is because of Rapapa, because Amar Rapapa le'nitzrucha ela lesser yoshel lefanav, hachanami le'nitzrucha ela lesser liyaim shel achrav. We needed this in order to ask for the day afterwards. In other words, we wanted to make sure, we needed to mention all those 8 days because we needed to include all the days, the day afterwards. Right? In other words, had we just gone up until, remember, mitmanya from the 8th day ad soif mayada, if he would not have said until the end of Yom Tif, so then we would have just come to a hard stop when it came to Yom Tif, but then we would not have the day afterwards. So therefore, it needed to be included in Megillah's Taanis that we don't say the Spedim throughout Yom Tif, even though Yom Tif itself warrants its own halachas, who would say not to say a hesped. We had to include that to include Isru Chag, to include the day afterwards. So Gemara says, hold on a second. If you're telling me that we're going to include the day afterwards, Kiman, whom are we following when we say this? If you remember in the Mishnah had a machlekes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi. Kiman, Rabbi Yossi, the Amar, what does he say? He says, Bein lefanov, bein la'achrov. Anytime we have these days that we can't say a hesped, we can't fast, it always includes the day beforehand and the day afterwards. Kiman, Rabbi Yossi, the Amar, bein lefanov, bein la'achrov aser. So the Gemara said, and therefore, ihachi be'esrim v'tisha nami. If that was the case, that we're always including the day before and the day afterwards, you started too late. You're telling me from Rosh Chodesh, but the truth is, you should also include the 29th day. And we'll see why very soon. My area, to have a yom de mikame yom de mitukum tamida, typically to have a yom de basar esrin utmanya. Why do we have to say that's going to be the day which comes beforehand? In other words, the day before Rosh Chodesh. Why can't we just say this is the day after the 28th of Adar? Now, what's the 28th of Adar? We're not familiar with any holiday on the 28th of Adar, and I think that this Gemara is just one of those Gemaras where it's striking how it hits us today on Hanukkah. Even though the Gemara is not talking about Hanukkah, it's a very strong, striking resemblance of Hanukkah. The Gemara explains, Titania, where we learned in a brayso in Rosh Hashanah, be'esrim utmanya bay, in the 28th day of the month of Adar, asa besurta tavta liyudai. A very good piece of news showed up by the Yehudai, by the Jews. What was the good news? The lo yi'idun minay raisa. They're not going to be separated from the Torah. Why? Shapam achas, one time, nigzura gezerah al Yisrael. There was a terrible decree that was decreed against the Jewish people. They're not allowed to learn Torah. They can't perform a bris milah on their children. That they were obligated by law to violate the Shabbos, which is, a striking resemblance of Hanukkah. It's Hanukkah today. Now, this Gemara is not talking about Hanukkah. We'll see this is coming from the Malka Esterson. This is a Roman decree. In other words, there never was a shortage of times in history of Klal Yisrael that our adversaries fell short of coming up with things to make our lives a little more difficult. But here, clearly, this is something which there was a gezerah from Malchus Roimi. The Romans, they instituted this gezerah, and these 3 gezerahs, which were very specifically relevant to Hanukkah as well, became batal on that day. So what happened? The Gemara says, what happened when they instituted this decree, when they put together this takana, that the Jews were obligated to, number 1, they were not allowed to learn Torah. Number 2, they were not allowed to give a bris milah. And number 3, they were obligated to Michal Shabbos. Ma'asa, Yehuda ben Shamua. What did Yehuda ben Shamua do? Ma'asa Yehuda ben Shamua v'chaverov. Halchu v'natlu eitzu v'matrunisa achas. He took an eitzah. They went to get some sage advice from a particular woman. Shekol gedeli roimi mitzuyanet. In other words, this is a very popular woman who was constantly giving advice to all the, upper echelons of Rome, and they went to ask her what to do. And she said, Amra lahem, she said to them, Imdu v'hefginu balayla. Go make a hafgana. What's a hafgana? A protest. So she recommended, apparently they had First Amendment rights even then. She said to them, go out in the evening and go make a protest. Now, in Rabbeinu Gershom, he writes, why do it by night? Why can't you just do it during the day? So he says simply, they didn't have microphones back then. Everyone was busy traveling and everyone was honking their horns. So therefore, you can't do it during the day. No one's going to hear you. So Rabbeinu Gershom on the side says, "V'afginu b'layla k'dei sheyishma kehilla." You should do it at night because, like this, at least your voice will be heard. There are some who explain that the reason why they did it at night was because there was a particular skula for doing things like this at night. That's when Yaakov fought with the Malach, and it's a better time for our tefillos to be niskabel, to be heard at nighttime. But ultimately, here we see again, it's just important to point out that these three things constantly came under attack: learning Torah, Bris Milah, and Shabbos. Why? Because those are the three unique things about Jews. Of course, we have many unique things about us, but these are the things that clearly separate us from other nations. And nobody likes that there's anything special, anything particular about the Jews which make them special. So this was constantly under attack. And here again we have that in Adar there was this gezerah, and ultimately we'll see what happened. They went into the streets and halchu v'fkinu b'layla. They followed her advice. They went v'fkinu b'layla, made this protest in the evening. Amru eishamayim. So first, it's important to point out, they started off. How does the hafkanah start? They started off with tefillah. And as Rashi says, Aha Hashem. And Rashi says, La Kadosh Baruch Hu hayutzayakim. They were crying out to Hashem, Al Oisam shegazra aleim gezeres kashrus, v'hayu oimrim lahem l'fnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'chiloi acheichem. And they would say this in front of the Kadosh Baruch Hu. In other words, they recognized that their salvation is not going to come by going into the street and screaming and yelling. They needed to come together. A proper afkanah is not just coming together and making lots of noise and breaking things. It's not what they were doing. They were coming together. A lot of Yidden come together. What do? You daven. Now, they started off by saying, Ei Shemayim. In other words, referring to Kadosh Baruch Hu. Hashem, where are you? Please help us. Keli lama azavtani. Why did you leave us? But what were the words that they said? They said, Lo yacheichem anachnu. Aren't we your brothers? Aren't we all ultimately children of the same father? Aren't we the children of the same mother? Manish taninu. What is it? In other words, they said clearly, what do you want from us? Just leave us alone. You don't bother anybody else. But constantly, time after time after time again, just bothering us. You don't leave us alone. All we want to do is learn Torah. All we want to do is give a bris milah to our children. We want to keep Shabbos. Why does that bother you so much? You don't bother anybody else, any other religions. And ultimately what happened, ubitlam, that worked. And their plea was successful. So of course we have to recognize it was a nes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hashem helped them out, and they were menatzeach. They prevailed. But this was the plan that they used. They went out to the streets and they had this cry of just leave us alone. Literally, just leave us alone. And ubitlam v'oisa yom asu yomtiv. They made this day into a yomtiv. So, in other words, the Gemara is asking a question here. We got off on a tangent with this story. The Gemara's question was, if this story happened on the 28th, then the 29th day, which is the day before Rosh Chodesh, is always going to be a day that you can't fast and you can't give espedim, simply because, according to your logic, we're following Rabbi Yossi. And Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that it's always the day before and the day afterwards. So in other words, as the Gemara said, which just follow the train of thought, the Gemara started off asking, why do you need to say from the 8th day through Yom Tov, we can't fast and we can't say a hesped? The Gemara's answer was, it was important to mention that because we needed to include the day that follows Yom Tov. Had we just allowed Yom Tov to work in its own right and say on Yom Tov there's no fasting and there's no espedim, so then it certainly would have worked, but we would have lost out on Isru Chag. Isru Chag itself would have been a day that hesped and Taanis would be mutter. So therefore we said throughout the whole Yom Tov, according to Rabbi Yossi, we don't fast the day afterwards either. So now if it's true that the day after any one of these events also is a day which is a Yom Asar behesped u'b'Taanis, so then the 29th day would be included anyway. We don't need to have that it's the day before Rosh Chodesh, because it's included in the day after the 28th. We never mentioned the 28th up until now because it wasn't important for this discussion. But now that we're talking about the day after any of these particular events also being included, so then we no longer need to know anything about the day before Rosh Chodesh, because the day before Rosh Chodesh always is going to be the 29th. So therefore the 29th would be a day which is also b'hesped u'b'tainis simply because it's the day after the 28th. So the Gemara answers the Ravaya, you need this for a Chodesh Me'uber and Iber Yard. Now Rashi has two understandings. One of them is that it's talking about an Iber Yard in the literal sense of the word, like we have this year, with an extra Adar. And when you have an extra Adar, what happens is, the second one, Rashi says, Tahasta ki havi Adar sheni malei havi yom shloshim lifnei Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So that's one understanding, is that there's two Adars and the second Adar has 30 days. The other understanding is that it doesn't mean that there's actually a whole extra month, but again, we're talking about a period of time when they were Mekadosh to Chodesh based upon the witnesses, Eidim, who would come and say they saw the Levana. So in this case, it doesn't mean that it's a Chodesh Me'uber, it just means they came a day late. Rashi writes, Inami de Avrua la'adar kagon shelo nira Chodesh Yom Lamed. They didn't see the new moon right away, and therefore the month ended up getting extended anyway, and therefore they had a 30th day. The bottom line is, in any case, the most important piece of information here is that you could have 2 days between the 28th and Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So if it's a normal month, then 29th will be the last day. The 28th, the 29th will be the last day, which will always be Erev Rosh Chodesh. But under any one of these circumstances, it comes out that you have a 30th day, so then you'll have a second day there, which separates between the 28th and Rosh Chodesh, and therefore you have to have the halacha that Erev Rosh Chodesh would be Asr b'hesped u'b'tainis. Again, Erev Rosh Chodesh Nisan would be Asr b'hesped u'b'tainis. Just to mention, it seems like Tosfos just takes the simple approach. And he writes, it's in all the way at the top of the Nitzach el Chodesh Me'uber, Pirish de Avrua la'adar, shlo nira halavana ad yom lamed. Rosh Chodesh Nisan yom lamed aleph. Pirish, and he explains, Vimkein, hai chav tes lo matzinu la'osro, mishum yom shalifnei Rosh Chodesh, the yom lamed mafsik bein tayim. And Tosfos just seems to take the simple approach that he just goes straight to the point. Without talking about whether there's two Adars, one Adar, the point just is that you could have an Adar that has 30 days. If you have an Adar which has 30 days, then the 29th day is not going to be Erev Rosh Chodesh, and therefore you have to just be explicit about what the halacha is going to be. Ravashi Yomar Afilu Teimel Chodesh Chaser. Ravashi answers this question as well. We could even be talking about Chodesh Chaser, and he writes, Kol Shla'achrav B'tainis Aser B'hesped Mutter. He says, in other words, this is not really a problem, because there's a difference between the day afterwards and the day beforehand. Any time which says that the Yom Achrav is also Aser, he says you could draw a distinction between Hesped and Taanis. Taanis fasting is going to be a problem, but Espedim are going to be mutter. V'zeh hayal umutul bein shnei yamim tovim asuak yom tov atzmo. And he says something very interesting. This is like an interesting day where it's sandwiched between two very special days. Yesterday was the 28th, which was a Yom Tov, because that was the day when the salvation came from this Roman decree where the Jews could not practice their religion freely. The next day is going to be Rosh Chodesh, where the story of the Karban Talmud came about. So you have this one day of the 29th sandwiched between. We don't want to just have a regular day squished in between. We have a similar concept of this. It's called the Yom Miyuchas. It's actually, Yom Miyuchas is not really Miyuchas for anything. What is it? The beginning of Sivan, you have Rosh Chodesh, then you have Shloshis Me'agbala. So you have that one day where it's nothing. So that's called the Yom HaMiyuchas. Right? Because you have the Shloshis Me'agbala before Shavuos, then you have Rosh Chodesh. There's that one day which is nothing. It's called the Yom HaMiyuchas. We don't want to have that day just as being nothing, like a one idle day sandwiched in between. What he's saying over here is, normally, any day which follows a day, it would be Asr B'hesped, it would be forbidden it would be Asr to fast, but it would be permissible to have a Hesped. This day is unique because it's sandwiched between Rosh Chodesh and this special time when ultimately we prevailed over the Tzedukim, and therefore, Asuk Yom Tov Atzmo, they actually treated it like Yom Tov itself. And therefore, Afilu B'hesped Nami Aser, and also became Aser with Hespedim, with eulogies. All right, Amar Mar, Mitmanya Bey, from the 8th day, Va'ad Sof Moada, Itosav Chaga Dishvua. We are able to ultimately prevail over the holiday of Shvuaya, of Shavuos. Lo Mispud, that we should not say Hespedim. So Lamali Lamemar Mitmanya Bey, why do we have to include the 8th day? Lema Mitisha Bey, Mitmanya Gufei Aser, Tehevele Yoma Ditukum Beit Mida. Day 8 gets doubled over. Because we said from Rosh Chodesh and through day 8, there's no Hespedim and no Taanis. In other words, that was a day, those days were written in Megillas Taanis. Why? Because that was the period of time when we prevailed over the Tzedukim with regard to the carbon tamid, and we were able to actually prove where the funds should come from. We know those funds we mentioned yesterday come only from the communal funds. The Tzedukim wanted to insist that it comes from a Yachid, and during that period of time, ultimately we were Minatzeach, we prevailed over them, and we won. That includes day 8. And then we say from day 8 through the end of Yom Tov. So day 8 is covered on both sides. So why do you have to say both? So Lamali Lememar Mitmanya Bey, Lema Mitisha Bey, Utmanya Gufei Aser Devele Yoma Ditoka Beit Mida. The Gemara says, Kivan di Ilu Mikla, Milsa Ubatline Lishiva, Utmanya Gufei Aser, Devele Yoma Kama Ditos Bechagad Dishvua. What the Gemara says over here is, we know that all of these Yom Tovim ultimately were batal. We don't have Purim or Chanukah on the 28th of Adar. We have Purim. I'm going to see soon how the date could change. We have either on the 14th or the 15th of Adar, but we don't have a Yom Tov. We don't have Chanukah in the middle of Adar. So all these Yom Tovim eventually were batal. So the Gemara says the reason why we had to mention the 8th day twice, because we were concerned that maybe one of these periods of time, one of these Yom Tovim will ultimately become batal, and if that happens, we wanted to have the other side will still be there to protect the 8th day. So to make sure that the 8th day is covered on both sides, in case one of the Yom Tovim ultimately became batal, we mentioned it twice. So Gemara says, Hashem to Asus Lahachi, now that you've come to this, Estrin V'Tisha, Nami, the 29th day also, Kivan di Ilu Mikla Milsa, Ubatline L'Estrin Mutmanya. What would happen if we're going to be mevatel the 28th day? So Esmatisha Gufei Aser Devele Yoma Debekame Yoma Ditokim Tmida. That's why we have to have that day anyway. Like this will be the day before Rosh Chodesh. In other words, the original question that we asked about why do we have to have a special Erev Rosh Chodesh to include it? Why can't we just include it in the day after the 28th? Well, the answer will be because what's going to happen is if we're mevatel it, then we end up not having that Yom Tov, so therefore we include it on both sides. In other words, what's coming out over here is we recognize that these Yom Tovim were not necessarily established to be there always throughout the history of all the Jewish people. And therefore we recognize it's important to mention every single day, even though we may double up those days, and you may be redundant in having one day being included in two lists, but we have to recognize if we're going to be mevatel one of them, we want it to still be there within the other one. Itmar Chiyabar Asi Amarab Halacha Kreb Yossi. How do we paskin? So again, just to see this machlokes inside in the Mishnah. It's the 4th line in the Mishnah on Daf Tes Vav Amud Beis. Kol HaKasav v'Megillas Taanis D'lo L'Mispad Bahon. D'lo L'Mispad L'fan of Aser L'Achrav Mutter. The day beforehand is Aser. The day afterwards is going to be Mutter. Rabbi Yossi Yomer L'fan of Ula Achrav Aser. Rabbi Yossi says the day beforehand and the day afterward is also going to be Aser. And again, Lo L'sana L'fanav L'Achrav Mutter. Yossi Yomer L'fanav Aser L'Achrav Mutter. So here, how do we paskin? Says the Gemara, Halacha Kreb Yossi. Well, Shmuel Amar, Shmuel says Halacha Kreb Meir. The halacha is like Reb Meir, and it does not include the day after, only the day before. So Gemara asks, Umi Amar Shmuelach, is it true that Shmuel said this? V'atanya B'Shimon Gamliel Amar, Ma Tam Alemer Bahon, Shtei Pamim. Why does it have to say the word Bahon within them? Why have to say that word so many times? We get it. So he says, Lomar Lach, Shein Asurin Lifneyen, ula achreim. To say that they're asur beforehand and afterward. Sorry. Shenasrun lefneim, ula achreim, and afterwards it's mutter. V'amar Shmuel, halacha k'Reb Gamliel. Shmuel says the halacha is like Reb Gamliel. So we say clearly he says like Reb ben Gamliel. So the Gemara says something very interesting. Meikara savar kiven deleka tano demekel k'Rabbi Meir. Amar halacha k'Rabbi Meir. Originally, when he thought the most lenient opinion was Reb Meir, he said the halacha was like Reb Meir. Kiven deshami l'Rabban Shimon. The mekel tfei, once you heard of this opinion from Shimon, was even more mekel, amar halacha k'Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. In other words, it was evolving. In other words, it depended where he was up to in terms of his knowledge of who was the most mekel. Okay, v'chein amar Bali, amar Mechia bar Abba, amar Rabbi Yochanan, halacha k'Rabbi Yossi, the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi, amar le Mechia lebali, az berlacha, ki amar Rabbi Yochanan, halacha k'Rabbi Yossi, adalo les'ana. That was referring to not fasting. So just quickly, if you look at Rashi, the second to last line, aval adalom lemispad, with regard to the halacha of saying hespedim ein halacha k'Rabbi Yossi, the halacha is not like Rabbi Yossi. To amar lefanav ula achrav aser, that both beforehand and afterwards you can't say a hesped. Ela k'Rabbi Meir, like Rab Meir. To amar lefanav aser la'achrav mutar, he said it was permissible to say a hesped the day afterwards. And therefore, the halacha is that you are allowed to say the hesped on the day afterwards. Now, Rabbi Yochanan hachi. Can it be that Rabbi Yochanan said this? Amar Rabbi Yochanan halacha k'sta mishnah. How could it be that he's paskening like Rabbi Yossi? Rabbi Yochanan always paskens like a stam mishnah. Now, what's the stam mishnah that we have to deal with? Utnan, and we learned afal pisha amar makdimim v'lo ma'achrin. This is a halacha with regard to Megillah, Pesach's Megillah, that we're allowed to bring the reading of the Megillah back earlier. Now we have to understand what the Gemara is talking about here is that the Mishnah was discussing people would come into town. They lived in towns, but they didn't have anybody who was able to read the Megillah where they were. Either they didn't have enough people, or they didn't know how to read it. So now they would come into town to do business, and we wanted to work it out that it will be able to be a convenient time for them to hear the Megillah. So they're depending on when Purim fell out that year, is how many days earlier they would actually move back the Kriyas HaMegillah. So you could move it back, but you can't be ma'achar. So turning the page to the top of your ches. So even though it says makdimim v'lo ma'achar, you could be makdim, you could move the Kriyas HaMegillah back. So the top of your ches is mutarin behesped u'v'tainis, you're allowed to say hesped and tainis. So the Gemara is setting up a halacha over here that there's going to be a day that you're going to move the Megillah back to, and that's going to be a day when you will read the Megillah, but the day is going to be permissible with hesped and tainis. So the Gemara says, Emas. What's this day? Ilema, if you're talking about Bnei Chamesar, people who lived in a walled city, who read the Megillah on the 15th day, and what they're doing is, the Kakar Leibar Beisar, they are reading the Megillah a day earlier. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry, you can't do that. Umi Shari, is that permissible? Vaksiv, the Megillah's Taanis, it says, in Megillah's Taanis, Yom Arba Asar Bo, Yom Chamisha Asar Bo, Yemei Puraya, Inun. Lo L'Mitzvah Bahon, you can't say hesped on that. In other words, the halacha can't be true that somebody who is a Bnei Chamesar, who lives in a walled city, who should hear the Megillah on the 15th day, and he's hearing it on the 14th day, that would be a day which is mutter behesped, because it's not. It's very clear. The 14th and 15th day are days that are asur with hesped. V'amar Rava lo nitzracha elo lesar es shel ben zeh. Sorry, es shel zeh bazeh v'es shel zeh bazeh. To say that there's an isser for a person who lives in a 15th place or a 14th place. In other words, both days, regardless of which one you're observing, are asur behesped u'v'tainis. So in other words, it can't be that there's a halacha that on the 14th day or on the 15th day it would be mutter behesped, that you're allowed to say the eulogy, because those days are objectively off limits for the hesped, because there's Megillah on both of those days. V'ela b'nei beisar must be, we're talking about a person who lives outside of a walled city. and he reads Megillah on the 14th day. V'kakari le betleisar, and he is reading it on the 13th day. So again, if you look at Rashi, v'kakari b'yud gimel, kagon shechal yud dalid b'gimel b'Shabbos, the 14th day fell out on Tuesday. So now he comes to work, he comes into the city the day before, so therefore makdimin liyom haknisa. We move it back, we move it one day back in order to accommodate the people who are coming in for the Yom HaKnisa, for the marketplace, the day earlier. The Gemara says it can't be that you're going to allow Hespedim on that day. Yom Niknarhu. That's Yom Niknar. We'll see soon what Yom Niknar is. Ve'ela b'nei arbeisar. It must be, it's a person of the 14th day, v'kakar le betreisar. He's reading it on the 12th day. Now how does that work out? If you look at Rashi, b'nei yudalad v'kar b'yud beis, shechal yudalad b'revi, Purim of the 14th fell out on Wednesday, b'revi b'Shabbos, v'kdimu liyom haknisa d'hainu yud beis. So again, the 14th falls out on Wednesday, so you move it all the way back to the 12th on Monday. Gemara says you can't do it that day either, because that's Yom Taanis. It's another holiday of Yom Taanis. Again, we'll see what that is very soon. Elav dekarole b'chadesar. It must be, this is one of those cases where you're actually reading it on the 11th, which is the week before. The Katani, and we learned, mutter behesped ubetainis. So the Gemara says, and says, it's mutter behesped ubetainis. The Gemara says, lo, b'nei arbeisar v'kakarle betreisar. It must. That's not the day. In other words, this would be the Stam Mishnah. That would be the problem that goes not like the opinion that we mentioned earlier, which said that it would be aser on the Yom Shalafan of Rabbi Yossi. In other words, Rabbi Aharon was one who said the halach is like Rabbi Yossi, but we have a Stam Mishnah that says not like that it's actually mutter. In other words, it says clearly it's mutter b'aspidu b'tainis, and that's the day beforehand, not like Rabbi Yossi. Where it says lo b'nei our basar, it must be talking about it was people of the 14th. In other words, they live in a city where they read the Megillah on the 14th. The kakarle b'treisar, they're reading it on the 12th. Ka'amret, you're telling me what's the problem? That's already Yom Taanis. Yom Taanis gufei betuli batla. This is, again, we mentioned earlier, they were mevatel Yom Taanis. We'll see again what the Gemara is going to tell us exactly what this holiday of Yom Taanis is. Why were they mevatel Yom Taanis? Gemara says, Hayil v'nergu by Shemaya v'achia achav. Shemaya and his brother Achia were killed on that day. Now, who were these two people, Shemaya and his brother? We don't know. If you look at Rashi says Shemaya v'Achia chasidim hayu v'loy pirish miheim. They were very pious and special Jews, and they were killed on those days. When we see chasidim hayu, it doesn't mean that they had long payas and they wore a rekel on Shabbos. It means that they were very special people. They lived their lives l'fnim yishur sadin. They went beyond the letter of the law to serve the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And again, the historical context of this must have been lost. We don't know who they were. We just know their names. Because they died, they were killed on those days, we decided to uproot the holiday. In other words, the holiday that was warranted because of the story of Taanis ultimately was uprooted because of this terrible tragedy that day. Kihad Amar of Nachman, Gazar, Tanisa, Betreisar, they made a Taanis on Treisar, the 12th day. Amrulei, the Rabbanan said to him, Yom Taanis, it's Yom Taanis, you can't make a Taanis on this day. Amalahu Yom Taanis Gufa Betuli Batluo, Hayil V'nergu B'Shmaya V'Achya Achav. Because Shmaya and his brother Achav were killed on that day, they decided to uproot the holiday of Yom Taanis. Gemara says, V'tepekle Tehevele Yom Shalifnei Niknar. Why don't we say it's the day before Yom Niknar? In other words, it's Yom Niknar also. Gemara says, Ravashi Hashta Iu Kufe Batlu Mishum Yom Niknar Nikum Nigzar. They were mevatel the whole thing, so they're going to go ahead and put it back in there because of the day before. In other words, they're mevatel the whole Yom Tif of Yom Taanis because of this terrible tragedy. You're going to say, so now we're going to reinstate the Isser of Hesped and Taanis because it's the day before Yom Niknar. In other words, even the Yom Niknar would have been uprooted because of this. So you're going to tell me that because it's the day before Yom Niknar, which is on the 13th, therefore we're not going to allow Hesped and Taanis. We already uprooted a whole holiday for this. So therefore it's not going to help us. So now the Gemara asks the important question. My Niknar or my Taanis? What are these people? So the name Niknar we know from the story in Maseches Yuma that there was these doors that were brought, Shar Niknar. This is not the same person. Sorry. The Tanya, for it says, Niknar echad mi'afrache Yevanim. He was one of the Greek officers. Again, Yevanim on Chanukah. So he was echad mi'afrache Yevanim haya, ubechal yom v'yom. He had this obsession. Every single day, he would go out and do the same thing. Hayamein yada al Yehudim Yishlayim, he would stretch out his hands on Yehudim Yishlayim, v'aymer, emasai tipol biyadi v'armasena. When will I ultimately trample on these Jewish people? In other words, he was a tyrant who literally every single day harassed the Jewish people, and he was waiting for that day to finally take over and swallow up and trample over the Jewish people. And I feel like I'm reading Alanisa in the middle of davening today. When the Beis Chashmonai ultimately were successful and they prevailed, the Nitzcham katzitzu bahonas yadav raglav. They cut off his thumbs and his big toe. The Talom b'shara Yerushalayim. They finally took this tyrant and he hung him on the gates of Yerushalayim. V'amru Peshayim Adaber begaiva. This mouth that spoke with such arrogance, v'yadayim shayim manifes Yerushalayim. These hands that he would stretch out over Yerushalayim, tas behem nakama. He's finally getting what he deserved. So again, this guy who literally harassed the Jews day in and day out, finally when the Chashmonayim were menatzech and they prevailed, they finally just gave him what he deserved, and they made a Yom Tov out of that. That was the Yom Niknar. Okay, so my Taanis, who's this person Taanis? Amar, they say, K'shebikesh Taanis larigas es lulinus upapas achiv belutkia. He wanted to kill these two people. Now, again, this story is not so clear exactly what happened, but Rashi tells us that it's in Rashi belutkia. There's a period in the middle. Rashi says, "V'yesh amr shenergu al bito shel melech shenimtzas haruga." The daughter, the princess of the king, was found killed. V'amru, and people said, of course, who's responsible? Who else? The Jews. And who else would be responsible for someone who died? V'amru haYehudim hargua. The Jews killed her. V'gazru gezerah al saneim shal Yisrael. They made a gezerah that they're going to wipe out all the Jews. So v'amdu elu upadu es Yisrael v'amru anu haragnuha. We are the ones who killed her. V'harag hamelech elu bilvad. These two were killed. So we'll hear the story about them in a minute. This actually is a famous tshuva from Moshe. Moshe discusses, is it mutter to do that? They didn't kill. You know, a Lulinus and Papas Achiv, they didn't kill her. But they realized that if they are going to stand up and take the hit, then all the rest of Klal Yisrael will be saved. So it's a very interesting and fascinating discussion. Was that mutter to do? And Moshe discussed this in a very long tshuva. But ultimately, Amar Lahem, you said to them, if you are from the same nation as Chanani, Mishal, and Azariah, in other words, let's see what your God can do to protect you from me. In other words, I'm about to kill you. So if you guys really think so much of yourselves, let's see what's going to happen here. In other words, they said, he said, Taanis said to Lulinus and Papas ben Yehuda, if you guys are from the same nation as Chanani, Mishal, Barzaya, they were also put to death by Nebuchadnezzar. Ultimately, they were saved. So let's see if you have the same God who's protecting you. Amru Allah, they said to him, Chanani, Mishal, Barzaya, tzadikim gemurim hayu. First of all, we are not on the same level as Chanani, Mishal, Barzaya. They were tzadikim gemurim, and v'ru'uyin hayu lasis lahem nes. They deserved to have a miracle be performed on behalf of them to save them. Not only that, Nebuchadnezzar melech hagun haya. Nebuchadnezzar was a proper king. Now it's important to point that Nebuchadnezzar was no great tzaddik. He destroyed the Beis Hamikdash. But I mean, he had lots of problems. But at least they felt that compared to you, Taanis, he was a proper person. In other words, you're that bad that Nebuchadnezzar was at least considered to be a Melech Hagan. And the Gemara does say that there were certain things about Nebuchadnezzar which at least classified him to a certain extent as proper. And therefore, V'roi lasis nes al yadai, it was appropriate that a nes could happen under something that he is doing. However, v'aisei rasha hedyitu, in other words, pretty much said, you're just a lowlife. Ve'enei roi lasis nes al yadai, and therefore it's not worthy that a Kadosh Baruch Hu should get involved in you. V'anu, therefore it must be, v'anu us, nischayavnu klaya lamakam, we must be deserving of death. V'meina ta hargenu, if you're not going to kill us, harbe hargum yesh lamakom, there are plenty of ways that Kadosh Baruch Hu can get us. V'harbe dubim, v'arayes yesh lamakom, there's no shortage of bears and lions that can come attack us. V'olamo shapogim bo v'hargan osan. So therefore, Ella Loma sarno Kadosh Baruch Hu biyadcha Ella sh'asid lifra damenu miyadcha. In other words, they said to him, you know what? It must be that we're deserving of this. In just some context, realize, when I'm mentioning this thing about whether it was mutter for them to stand up to have themselves saved, they were going to be killed anyway. Because the Gzeir was to kill everybody. So now they understood that they were going to be killed. So they said to Taanis, listen, we must deserve this for some reason. We don't know exactly why, but we deserve it. And therefore we have to make sure that we can't put ourselves to the test of Hanani, Mishael, V'Azariah, because we must deserve it. If it won't be you who will kill us, it will be a lion, it will be a bear, it will be something else who will come attack us. Why is it that you have the schus to kill us? The reason why you have the schus to kill us is she'asid li para dimenum yadcha. Kadosh Baruch Hu will take revenge over you. Afal pikein hargan. Nevertheless, with all his gaiva, all his arrogance, he went and he killed them. Miyad, hargan miyad. Amru, they said, Leizazu Misham, they didn't leave this place. At Shabo Diufli Miromi, a Roman general came, Upatsu Asmocho Begzir, they took wood bats and they whacked him over the head and busted his brains. Literally, they busted his brains. That's what Gemara says. So in other words, he wasn't deserving that a miracle should happen under his watch. Why was it that under his watch he had the terrible opportunity to kill these tzaddikim? Why? Because he deserved to be punished himself, and therefore he had to be set up for that. Let's just finish quickly. The Mishnah taught us, and goes in Taanis, we don't set up the Taanis, al tzibur b'tchilas chamishi, and goes in Taanis b'rosh chodashim, you don't start on Rosh Chodesh, we always start on the Monday or the Thursday. V'kama hevi aschala, what's considered a starting? In other words, what's considered that we started already, that we could continue into Rosh Chodesh? Rav Amar shalosh, has to be 3 times. Rasi Amar achas, even once. Yehuda Amar Rav lozu divrei Meir, Sha'amar mishun Rabbi Gamliel. Ava chachamim omrim mis'ana umashlim. He starts fasting and he finishes. Dars marzuch mishmei Rav Huna alacha mis'ana umashlim. That indeed they do start fasting and they finish until chashecha, until the evening, until the end. Hadron Allah say the Taanis Ketzad. Hadron Allah say the Taanis Ketzad. Mr. Shem, tomorrow we will start the third parak. Have a wonderful day and I pray